They say a mother's love is unconditional, but they never talk about the conditions children place on returning it. My name is Helen Whitaker. I'm 73 years old, and this is the story of the day my children decided I was too much trouble to love. Before we dive into her story, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Hearing from people around the world makes these stories even more powerful and reminds us how connected we all are. It was a Tuesday morning when it happened, an unusually warm day for early March. I remember it vividly because I'd been outside in the garden, pruning the rose bushes I'd tended for nearly 3 decades. My back ached from the bending, but my heart felt light. Gardening always gave me peace, something to nurture, something that bloomed because I cared enough to tend to it. Then I heard the tires crunching the gravel in my driveway. I wiped the dirt from my hands on my apron and looked up to see not one, not two, but all 3 of my children's cars pulling in Melissa's silver Lexus, Daniel's black pickup, and Rebecca's little red Audi. That alone should have told me something was off. It had been years since all 3 of them came to see me together. "Mom," Melissa called out as she got out of her car, her tone bright, a little too rehearsed. "We need to talk." They didn't even come inside right away, just stood in the driveway like they were about to deliver a verdict. I smiled, waved them in, and led them into the house, the home I'd lived in for 45 years, the place their father and I had built together when we were young and broke and full of dreams. We sat in the living room, on the very same floral sofa I'd read bedtime stories on, wiped fevers from little brows on, and listened to teenage heartbreaks over. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, dancing across the photo frames I'd carefully arranged birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings, moments I had lived for. Melissa crossed her legs like she was in a boardroom. "Mom, we've been talking and we think it's time to consider your future. A different living arrangement." I blinked. "What do you mean, dear? I'm perfectly fine right here." Daniel looked down at his hands. "It's not safe anymore, Mom. You're alone, and we're all at least an hour away." Rebecca chimed in, tapping her smartwatch. "And with our schedules, it's just not practical to check in as often as we should." Practical. That word stung more than I let on. They handed me a glossy brochure, Sunny Haven Assisted Living. Bright, happy pictures of smiling elderly folks playing bingo, eating in groups, doing water aerobics. "We've already toured it," Rebecca added proudly. "You'd have your own room, great staff, and people your age to socialize with." I stared at the brochure, the colors blurring. "What about the house?" I asked, my voice quiet. Melissa perked up. "We were thinking, since it's in a seller's market, I could list it right away. That would help cover the cost of Sunny Haven." My fingers trembled slightly. I set the brochure down. "So, this has all been decided?" No, Daniel said, raising his palms. "We just wanted to present options." And you already paid a deposit," I said, glancing at the paper they tried to hide behind their backs. "Scheduled a tour, made arrangements." They didn't deny it. I looked at my 3 grown children, the lawyer, the business owner, the financial planner. I remembered staying up late, sewing costumes for school plays, skipping meals to save for college tuition, taking on a second job after their father left so they could have braces, sports fees, and everything in between. And now here we were, me reduced to a brochure and a transaction. "Okay," I said, after a long silence. "If that's what you've all decided, I'll go." The relief on their faces was like watching pressure deflate a balloon. They hugged me, told me I was being reasonable, that this would be good for everyone, that they'd visit all the time. I didn't believe them. 2 weeks later, the movers came. Melissa orchestrated everything like a corporate takeover. Daniel stood silent while Rebecca decided what I could bring. 2 suitcases, 3 boxes, 67 years of memories compressed into a van load. My quilts? Too bulky. The upright piano? No room. My rose clippers? Not necessary. On the drive to Sunny Haven, I stared out the window at the blooming dogwoods, at the garden slipping away in the rearview mirror. I didn't say a word. And when we pulled into the facility, a tidy little building with fake brick siding and tired flower beds, I felt the hollowness settle in. Tracy, the administrator, greeted us with a smile too practiced to be genuine. "We're so glad you're here, Mrs. Whitaker. We'll take great care of you." They showed me my room, a narrow bed, a small desk, one window overlooking the staff parking lot. My children stayed just long enough for formalities. No lingering, no hesitation. "We'll come back soon," Melissa promised. And then they were gone. Not even a glance over their shoulders. I sat on the bed for a long time, hands folded in my lap. I cried. 10 minutes. No more. Then I wiped my face, stood up, and looked out the window not to watch them leave, but to see what came next. Because what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had just inherited $7 million from my sister Catherine. And I wasn't going to tell them. Not yet. If you're still watching, comment one so I know you're still with. The nights in Sunny Haven were the loneliest. Not because it was silent, it wasn't. You could always hear someone coughing down the hallway, the wheels of a cart squeaking past your door, or the distant voice of a nurse reminding a resident to take their pills. But because in between those noises was a kind of emptiness that pressed against your chest like a heavy blanket. I didn't sleep much that first week. Not because of my age, Lord knows I've been waking at 4 a.m. for decades, but because my mind had begun arranging pieces like a chessboard. They thought I was done, that I had no more moves left, that I'd live out the rest of my days under fluorescent lighting and scheduled meal times. But they didn't know about Catherine. Catherine and I were never close in the conventional sense. She was 10 years older, wild, opinionated, and fiercely independent. While I stayed behind in Kentucky, married young, and raised a family, she moved to San Francisco, opened a gallery, and traveled the world. We sent Christmas cards, the occasional birthday call, but that was about it until she got sick. Cancer took her quicker than anyone expected, but not before she left me a handwritten letter and a will that would change everything. "I know what it feels like to give until you're empty," she wrote. "I know you loved them more than you loved yourself, but don't let that be the end of your story." Then came the shock. $7 million. All in my name. No strings. "Do something unexpected," she added. "Live like someone who matters." So I sat in that too-small room with its peeling wallpaper and predictable calendar of daily events: Bible study Monday, bingo Tuesday, movie night Thursday, and watched. I watched the nurses, overworked, kind, but stretched too thin. I watched the residents, quiet, lonely, many forgotten. And I watched the way the facility ran, efficient, but soulless. Sunny Haven looked polished on the outside, but it was running on fumes. That's when I met Robert, the young night nurse with kind eyes and quick hands. He reminded me of my grandson Liam, only more observant. "Mrs. Whitaker, can I adjust your blanket?" he asked one night around midnight. "You can sit down if you're not too busy," I said. He hesitated, then pulled the guest chair a little closer. "You like working here?" He gave a small shrug. "I like the people. The building, not so much." That was my in. Over the next few nights, I asked questions. Casual at first. How long has Sunny Haven been around? Is the owner local? Do they ever make improvements? Robert, unknowingly, became my best source of intel. He told me about the private equity group that had bought Sunny Haven and 4 other facilities across the state. He talked about budget cuts, layoffs, and corners being cut. The place was barely staying afloat. Perfect. I waited 3 more days before calling Marjorie, my attorney of 30 years. We hadn't spoken since Catherine's funeral. "Tell me what you know about RIS Long-Term Holdings," I said. She didn't question it. That's what I liked about Marjorie. 3 days later, I had a folder delivered to my room, sealed and discreet. Inside were details that confirmed what Robert had hinted at. Sunny Haven was in financial trouble. Its parent company was desperate to offload assets quietly, especially the underperforming facilities. The best part? No one knew who was behind RS Holdings. It was all shell companies and proxies. Which meant I could buy it quietly. I set the wheels in motion. Marjorie and her team created a new LLC under a name with no ties to me. We called it Second Light Enterprises. Through it, we began the process of acquiring Sunny Haven for a fraction of what it was worth. Negotiations were simple. RS Holdings just wanted it off their books. By the end of the month, I, Helen Whitaker, 73 years old and supposedly discarded by my own family, became the sole owner of the place they left me in. And nobody knew. I didn't want revenge. Not really. What I wanted was clarity. Would they still visit if they couldn't benefit from me? Would they still call if I stopped giving? I needed to know, but I wasn't going to beg. I began making quiet changes, starting with one small memo, effective immediately. All family visits must be scheduled in advance and are limited to 2 hours per week unless previously approved. Exceptions granted for emergencies and verified daily caregivers. The backlash was immediate. 3 days later, Melissa called Sunny Haven, furious. Who the hell made that decision? I have every right to visit my mother whenever I want. Tracy, the administrator, handled it with grace. Ma'am, the new policy comes from ownership. I'm afraid my hands are tied. Melissa tried calling me directly next. I let it go to voicemail. Rebecca sent a long email, angry, sharp, using words like inappropriate, inhumane, and unacceptable. Daniel didn't say anything. He just stopped coming. And I? I went about my days smiling politely, joining bingo on Tuesdays, nodding along during Bible study, and slowly transforming the place from the inside out. We introduced new menus, real food, hired 2 part-time staffers to lighten the load, started a small greenhouse out back. Then came the best part, the memory circle, an idea Margaret brought up one afternoon when we were watching rain roll down the windows. We all have stories, she said. We just need someone to listen. So every Friday at 3, we met in the library. No therapy, no agenda, just chairs, tea, and the freedom to speak. And we did about war, marriage, regrets, songs, first dances, lost loves. And the room began to breathe again. The staff noticed. The residents smiled more. Even Tracy pulled me aside one day and whispered, I don't know what's going on, Mrs. Whitaker, but thank you. I didn't respond, just smiled. Because this wasn't about recognition. It wasn't even about proving my children wrong. It was about reclaiming something that had been quietly stolen over the years. My dignity. And I wasn't done yet. If you're still watching, comment 1 so I know you're still with. It was amazing how a few words on a printed sheet could change everything. One morning in early May, Tracy tacked a single-page memo onto the community bulletin board next to the dining hall. White paper, black text, simple, clinical. But by the time breakfast trays were being cleared, it had become the sole topic of conversation. Effective immediately. Residents may only receive visits from family members during designated windows. Sundays between 2 o'clock and 4 p.m. visitors must register at least 48 hours in advance. Emergency exceptions require director approval. Margaret, my closest friend in Sunny Haven, read it aloud while buttering her toast. Well, this ought to stir the pot, she said, raising one arched brow in amusement. It did more than stir. It boiled over. That afternoon, the phone at the front desk rang off the hook. Tracy fielded calls like a soldier and a trench professional. Firm, repeating the same lines. Yes, I understand your concern, but the new policy is non-negotiable. No, I cannot give out the owner's contact information. I'm afraid this isn't up for discussion at this time. Oh, by Tuesday, the emails began to arrive, dozens of them. One particularly colorful one from Rebecca compared the policy to emotional imprisonment. Another from Melissa threatened to call the state licensing board. I overheard Tracy reading parts of it to one of the nurses, her voice tight with controlled irritation. Then came Wednesday. Melissa showed up in person. She arrived in a navy pantsuit and heels too high for walking across the gravel lot, her eyes scanning the building like a prosecutor entering a courtroom. I was in the garden, pruning the lavender with a pair of new shears I'd approved through the budget 2 weeks earlier. When I saw her coming, I didn't flinch. Mother, she said, arms folded. We need to talk. I kept trimming. They said I had to make an appointment. You're my mother. I shouldn't have to make an appointment to see you. And I looked up and gave her a small smile. Then maybe you should have visited more often when it was easy. That caught her off guard. She blinked. Excuse me? I set the shears down gently. Melissa, When was the last time you visited without scheduling it around a client meeting or asking me to sign something? When was the last time you sat with me without checking your watch? She opened her mouth to respond, closed it. I'm not mad, I continued, but I've spent a long time being available on everyone else's schedule. I think I've earned a little space. She looked away, swallowing hard. This isn't you, Mom. Someone's manipulating you. I chuckled. Melissa, I'm 73, not 7. No one's manipulating me. I left her standing there among the marigolds and went back inside. By Friday, the other residents were whispering about me in the halls, some with admiration, others with cautious curiosity. I didn't mind. Let them wonder. The thing was, I wasn't doing it just for myself. Over the weeks, I'd watched my neighbors, people like Mr. Caldwell, who hadn't had a visitor in 2 years, Eleanor Rios, whose daughter only came by to ask for money, Joe and Mabel, a couple married 60 years, now living in separate wings and too frail to walk the distance without staff help. I saw their faces light up when we shared stories in the memory circle, and dim again when the calls they waited for never came. So yes, maybe the policy sounded strict, but it was never about punishment. It was about revealing who actually cared. And surprisingly, the policy had a ripple effect I hadn't anticipated. On the second Sunday after it was posted, I noticed something different. The lobby filled with more visitors than I'd ever seen. Grown children with flowers, teenagers awkwardly holding cards, a grandson wheeling in a chessboard. The irony was almost too rich. Melissa came back too. This time, she signed in. Brought coffee. Saturday with me. We didn't talk about the memo. We talked about the lemon tree that used to grow in our backyard, and the time she broke her arm roller skating, and the time I let her skip school to watch a lunar eclipse. She stayed the full 2 hours. Afterward, as she stood to leave, she looked down and said, "You were always stronger than we gave you credit for." I didn't reply, just touched her hand and let the silence fill with everything I couldn't say. But not all my children were ready to listen. Daniel didn't come at all. And Rebecca? She came to fight. The following Sunday, she burst into my room without knocking, her cheeks flushed, her voice loud enough to draw eyes from the hallway. "This is insane, Mom. You've let someone turn you against us. You're not thinking clearly." "Actually," I said, setting aside my knitting, "I've never been more clear. And you've got everyone fooled. They think you're some passive, sweet old woman, but you're being manipulative, vindictive. You're punishing us." "No," I said calmly. "I'm teaching you." Her lips tightened. "You're going to regret this when you're really alone." "I've already been alone," I replied. "You just didn't notice." She stormed out without saying goodbye. That night, I cried. Not because I regretted the policy or the confrontation, but because the truth of what I'd said settled into my bones like winter cold. I had been alone, and now that I had the power to set boundaries, I was finally being seen. Still, I didn't want things to stay this way forever. I didn't want war. I wanted awareness. And that's when the next idea came to me, small, subtle, but powerful. What if I gave them a glimpse of what they'd thrown away? Not with anger, not with punishment, but with dignity. It began with a shoebox, a plain, weathered cardboard box that had survived 4 moves, 2 floods, and 1 attic fire. Somehow, through all the changes and decades, it remained intact though faded and soft at the corners. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, maybe more. Helen sat cross-legged on her bed, shoebox open, evening light streaming through the window like honey across the floor. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out each memory, sepia smiles, creased edges, the faint smell of old tape and time. There was Melissa, 5 years old, holding a paper crown and beaming after her kindergarten play. Daniel at his high school graduation, tie crooked but proud. Rebecca at 13, covered in glitter from her first science fair poster. Moments Helen had stitched together like a quilt across years of sleepless nights and busy mornings. Moments her children had forgotten or perhaps chosen to forget. The idea had come to her days earlier, after Rebecca's angry outburst. Helen didn't want to fight. She wasn't interested in proving who was right. But maybe, just maybe, she could help them remember who they were, who they had been, and who she still was. She spoke with Tracy the next morning. "I'd like to host an event," Helen said. "Here, in the main lounge. Something for the residents and their families." And then Tracy tilted her head. "A party?" Helen shook her head, smiling gently. "A memory night. No balloons, no karaoke, just stories, photographs, maybe some music from when we were young." Tracy blinked. Then, slowly, she nodded. "That's beautiful. I'll put it on the calendar." Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, Helen had enlisted Margaret, Robert, the night nurse, and even Joe from down the hall to help with setup. The memory circle pitched in too, each resident invited to bring one item from their past: a photo, a journal, a recipe card, a record album, even an old scarf. Helen selected 3 pictures for the table marked Whitaker Family Memories. She printed short captions beneath each one, written in her gentle cursive. Melissa's first piano recital. She cried in the hallway but went back out anyway. Daniel's first car. We rebuilt the engine together in the garage. Rebecca's 6th birthday. She wore that tiara for 2 weeks straight. And then, just below them all, she placed a simple sign. "Thank you for being the best part of my story." The evening arrived like a quiet miracle. Soft jazz played on the speakers. The lounge lights dimmed slightly, giving the room a warm, golden glow. Folding chairs were arranged in a wide circle. Each station had a nameplate, a keepsake, and a plate of homemade cookies. Robert wheeled in Mrs. Rios. Joe helped Eleanor adjust her hearing aid. Even Tracy paused her clipboard parade to sit with Mr. Caldwell and ask about his photo of 1962nd Harlem. Then the door opened and Helen turned, heart skipping. Melissa walked in. So did Rebecca. And to her utter shock, Daniel came too. He wasn't holding flowers or a gift, just a folded paper in one hand and his eyes fixed on the carpet. But he was there. Helen greeted each of them with the same calm grace, offering no guilt, no commentary, just presence. "You made it," she said. Melissa smiled weakly. "I saw the flyer you mailed. I didn't know you kept those pictures." Rebecca's eyes were already glassy. "The tiara," she whispered, looking at the photo. "I can't believe you saved it." Helen said nothing. Let the moment speak for itself. They moved around the room slowly, stopping at the other stations, reading captions, listening to stories. One by one, they began to soften. Melissa knelt beside Margaret and asked about her days as a jazz singer. Daniel helped Robert pass out lemonade. Rebecca sat beside Eleanor and offered to read aloud her faded journal entry from 1972. Something gentle filled the space. It wasn't nostalgia. It was recognition. After an hour, Tracy stood up and asked if anyone would like to share something aloud. There was silence. Then Helen stood. She didn't walk to the center, just stayed by her table, fingers gently resting on the photo of Melissa's recital. "I've lived long enough to know," she said, voice steady, "that we don't always appreciate things until we've nearly lost them. But the beauty of memory is that it gives us a second chance, a chance to look again, to see not just what happened, but what mattered." She paused. "This place, Sunny Haven, was supposed to be my ending. But maybe, just maybe, it's a beginning instead." And then she sat down. Melissa wiped at her eyes. Rebecca reached for Helen's hand. Daniel didn't move, but his eyes met hers across the room. And in them, something had shifted. After the event, as the chairs were folded and the tables cleared, the 3 of them stayed behind. Melissa spoke first. "You've changed this place, Mom. It's different." "I didn't mean to change anything," Helen replied. "I just couldn't sit still." Daniel finally unfolded the paper in his hand. It was a copy of an old drawing he'd made when he was 10. A picture of their house, with stick figures out front and a crooked sun above. "You kept this in a box in the attic," he said. "I found it when we packed your things. I didn't think you'd ever looked at it." Helen smiled. "I looked at it every day." No one said much more. They didn't have to. But when they left that evening, they did something they hadn't done in a long time. They hugged her, all three. And as the door closed behind them, Margaret came over and patted Helen's arm. Was that the result you wanted? She asked. Helen exhaled. Number. It's the one I needed. Because maybe the real victory wasn't about teaching a lesson. Maybe it was about giving her children a place to return to. A memory worth coming back for. The Monday after memory night, the mood at Sunny Haven had changed. It wasn't just the residents who seemed brighter, it was the staff, too. Robert whistled as he checked vitals. Margaret wore lipstick for the first time in months, and even the usually gruff kitchen manager, Sam, started serving eggs with a side of humor. Tracy caught Helen by the coffee urn and whispered, I don't know what kind of magic you're pulling, but this place feels alive again. Endo. Helen smiled, but she didn't say it was magic. It was dignity, and she was just getting started. Over the next few weeks, Helen worked closely with Tracy to implement what she called dignity changes. Simple things at first. Fresh flowers in the entryway, handwritten nameplates for each room, a new playlist in the dining hall with old love songs and swing tunes from their younger years. Then came a small staff bonus, anonymous, of course, from Helen's personal funds, routed through Second Light Enterprises. They deserved to feel seen, too, Helen said when Tracy asked who the donor was. In the evenings, Helen sat in the garden with her notebook, jotting ideas for future projects. A reading nook, a visiting pet program, even a community bulletin board for birthdays and grandchildren's photos. It was working, slowly but surely. Sunny Haven was becoming what it should have always been, a place where people lived, not just waited to die. And yet, just when the light seemed to be pouring in, the shadow returned. It was a Tuesday afternoon when it happened. Helen was in the recreation room helping Mabel hang up watercolor paintings from the residents' art class. She heard the front door open, followed by quick, purposeful steps, heels on linoleum, the scent of perfume she hadn't smelled in years. Melissa. Not alone. With her was a sharply dressed woman in a tailored blazer, clutching a leather portfolio. Her gaze swept across the room with practiced calculation. Tracy stepped out from her office, her smile polite but tight. Can I help you? We're here to speak with the facility's owner, Melissa said, glancing briefly at Helen. There are legal matters that need clarification. Helen stepped forward before Tracy could answer. That would be me. The woman in the blazer blinked. I'm sorry, are you a representative? No, Helen said, steady. I am the sole owner of Sunny Haven. Purchased it 6 weeks ago through a holding company. Can I help you? Silence. The kind that sucks all the air from a room. Melissa's jaw twitched. Why didn't you tell us? Helen looked at her daughter with a calm she had practiced in the mirror. Because it wasn't your business until now. The woman beside Melissa cleared her throat. My name is Naomi Carter. I represent Miss Whitaker, your daughter. She has some concerns about the new visitation policies, resident privacy, and financial management. She intends to file an inquiry with the state health department. Tracy inhaled sharply. Helen didn't flinch. You're free to do that. Everything here is compliant. In fact, I'd be happy to provide documentation. Melissa's voice rose slightly. Mom, this is ridiculous. Why are you doing this? Creating rules to punish us, hiding ownership, what is this really about? Helen took a breath. This isn't about punishment. It's about protection. Of myself, of the other residents, of the people no one was listening to. You're pushing us away. No, Melissa. You walked away a long time ago. I'm just choosing not to follow. For a second, Melissa looked like she might cry, but her pride wouldn't let her. She turned, stiffly, and walked out with Naomi following close behind. Helen stood still in the silence that followed. Margaret came over quietly, slipping her hand into Helen's. That was brave, she said. And risky? I know, Helen whispered. But sometimes the only way to be heard is to speak in a voice they never expected. Still, that night, Helen didn't sleep. What if Melissa went through with the complaint? What if inspectors showed up, or funding was threatened? She had worked so hard to build something gentle and good, but one misunderstanding could undo it all. And worse, what if, despite everything, her children never came back? The price of reclaiming her dignity might just be permanent distance. And that, more than anything, made her heart ache. If you're still watching, comment once so I know you're still with her story. 2 days passed without a word from Melissa or Rebecca. Helen pretended not to mind. She went about her routines, morning walks in the garden, afternoon reading in the sunroom, evenings with Margaret by the piano. But inside, something had cracked. Not regret, not quite grief. Just a hollow ache that comes from knowing you've done what's right, but it still hurts. It was Friday afternoon when Daniel showed up. No warning, no call, just the low rumble of a pickup truck pulling into the staff parking lot, and the tall figure of a man in a faded flannel shirt stepping out with a small wooden box in his hands. Tracy met him at the front desk, eyebrows lifted. "Daniel Whitaker," he said simply. "I'm here to see my mother." Tracy looked surprised, but she waved him through. "She's in the greenhouse. Into 5. Helen was watering the new tomato sprouts, part of a resident gardening project she'd proposed the week before, when she heard the familiar creak of boots on gravel. She looked up. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then Daniel held out the wooden box. "I made this for you," he said. Helen took it gently, her hands shaking just slightly. The wood was warm, freshly sanded, with hand-carved roses along the edges, a lid hinged with care. Inside, resting on soft linen, was a tiny garden tool set perfectly scaled for raised beds and arthritic fingers. Trowel, spade, weeder, all polished, all engraved. Helen blinked back tears. "You remembered." Daniel shrugged, eyes on the floor. "You taught me everything I know about tools. Figured it was time I gave something back." They sat together on the bench near the tomato beds. No accusations, no apologies, just shared silence. After a while, Daniel spoke again. "I never said thank you." Helen glanced at him. "For what?" "For holding everything together after Dad left," he said. "For giving up weekends and new shoes and vacations so we could have what we needed. I didn't see it back then. I thought that was just what moms did." Helen smiled faintly. "It is. But not all moms do it like you did." She placed her hand over his. "I didn't need thank yous. I just needed to know you were okay." Daniel looked at her, then really looked. "I'm not proud of how I've handled things," he said. "I let the others take the lead because I didn't want to deal with the guilt. I knew we were putting you somewhere you didn't want to be. I just told myself it was better than being alone." Helen didn't speak right away. Then quietly, "Daniel, I was never afraid of being alone. I was afraid of being forgotten." He swallowed. "I know that now." They sat until the shadows lengthened across the garden. Before leaving, Daniel reached into his coat pocket and handed her a folded piece of paper. It was an old letter, Helen's handwriting, faded but clear. "I found this in your nightstand when we were packing up your things," he said. "It was addressed to me, but never mailed." Helen took it slowly. She had written it 5 years ago, after his divorce, when he'd stopped answering calls. It was full of worry and love and lines like, "You don't have to carry everything by yourself." I read it 3 times, he said. "Then I called my therapist." Helen laughed softly, surprised. "You're in therapy?" Daniel smiled. "Yeah. Turns out I have some stuff to work on." She reached out and pulled him into a hug. It wasn't long or dramatic, just firm, real. Before he left, Daniel turned at the doorway and said, "You're doing something good here, Mom. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." And then he was gone. Helen stood in the quiet greenhouse, holding the box of tools, the letter, and a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for years finally lifted. It happened on a Wednesday. Helen had just come in from the garden, fingers still dusty, when Tracy rushed into the lobby, her face pale. "It's Mrs. Rios," she said. "She fell near the east stairwell. Ems are on their way." Helen didn't hesitate. She followed Tracy down the corridor, her heart hammering. They found Eleanor Rios lying near the base of the last step, conscious but shaken. A nurse was already crouched beside her, checking her pulse. Eleanor's wrist was bent at an unnatural angle. "Helen Kaelpesil, her friend." "Eleanor, it's me. I'm right here." Eleanor's face tightened in pain. "I was trying to take the stairs." I didn't want to wait for the lift. Within minutes, the paramedics arrived and lifted her gently onto a stretcher. Before they wheeled her out, Eleanor reached for Helen's hand and whispered, "Don't let them blame you." Helen didn't understand what she meant until 2 hours later, when a black SUV pulled into the visitor lot and Eleanor's daughter, Patricia, stepped out like a thunderstorm. She didn't stop at the front desk. She didn't ask for permission. She marched straight to Tracy's office, slammed the door open, and demanded answers. "This is elder neglect," she snapped. "How does a 78-year-old woman fall down concrete stairs in a care facility?" Helen, calm as ever, stepped into the doorway. "Patricia, I'm terribly sorry this happened, but please understand. Eleanor chose the stairs. The elevator was available. She shouldn't have had that choice," Patricia snapped. "She's too fragile. It's your job to protect her from herself." Tracy tried to interject. "We've reviewed the cameras. There was no staff negligence. Mrs. Rios insisted." "I don't want excuses. I want accountability," Patricia interrupted. She turned to Helen, narrowing her eyes. "I've heard about your changes. Weekly limits, closed-door meetings, residents leading projects. This isn't a retirement home, it's a social experiment." Helen's voice didn't rise. "Patricia, your mother is one of the sharpest minds here. She didn't fall because of neglect. She fell because she tried to prove she could still do everything on her own. Haven't we all been guilty of that?" Patricia stared at her. "You're not a nurse. You're not even a licensed administrator. You're playing pretend with people's lives." That stung. Not because it wasn't partly true, but because it touched something raw. "I'm not playing pretend," Helen said softly. "I'm trying to build something human. But if you'd rather file a complaint than ask how your mother's doing, I can't stop you." Patricia left without another word. That evening, Helen sat alone in her room, staring at the wall. What if Patricia was right? What if she had gone too far, trusted the residents too much, assumed they all wanted agency? Maybe not everyone needed freedom. Maybe some needed fences. When the phone rang, she almost didn't answer. It was Eleanor, from the hospital. "Did she raise hell?" Eleanor chuckled. "You could say that." "I figured. She always thinks everything is someone else's fault." A pause. "Don't you dare change things because of this." Helen swallowed. "I don't want anyone else getting hurt." "And they will," Eleanor said firmly. "No matter how careful you are. But this place, it's the first time I've felt like more than just an old woman waiting to fade out. Don't take that away from us." Hele exhalet. The next morning, she met with the staff. "From now on, every resident will have a personalized care profile updated weekly. We'll track not just health needs, but emotional well-being and risk behavior. Not to control, but to support." Robert raised his hand. "And Mrs. Rios?" "She'll be back," Helen said, with a shiny new wrist brace and more opinions than ever. The room chuckled. Tracy smiled. "We're with you, Helen." Helen nodded. "Good, because this is just the beginning." The local news van pulled into the driveway just after lunch. It was a small crew, just a young reporter named Liz and her cameraman. But to Sunny Haven, it might as well have been national television. The residents gathered in the main hall like school kids, awaiting the yearbook photos, straightening sweaters and adjusting walkers. Helen watched quietly from the side as Liz interviewed Margaret, then Robert, then Tracy. The questions were simple. What made Sunny Haven different? Why did residents seem so happy? No one mentioned money. No one mentioned Helen. But their words carried a weight that didn't need explanation. "It feels like a place where we matter again," Margaret said. "Like someone remembered we still have stories to tell." By the time the segment aired 2 nights later on the local Charleston affiliate, Sunny Haven's phone line was flooded with inquiries. Could people visit? Was there a waiting list? Tracy looked overwhelmed but thrilled. "Helen, we have over 20 appointment requests for tours this week." Helen smiled, though a small worry gnawed at her. Growth was good, but too much. Too fast. And she risked losing what made the place special. So she moved carefully. She brought in a part-time therapist to lead weekly grief circles. She approved a budget for sensory-friendly renovations, softer lighting, warm colors, calming spaces. She even had the idea to add a community storytelling program. where residents could record their memories to share with local schools. It was working, until a knock came at her door one quiet Thursday morning. Melissa. Again. But this time, she wasn't dressed for battle. No briefcase, no lawyer in tow, just a cardigan, jeans, and a nervous smile that didn't reach her eyes. Helen stood. Melissa. I didn't come to argue, she said quickly. I wanted to talk. Just us. Helen nodded slowly and gestured to the chair by the window. They sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Melissa cleared her throat. I saw the news clip, and the article in the local paper. They mentioned a revolution in elder care. I recognized your handwriting on the sign in the background. Helen raised an eyebrow. And I realized something, Melissa said, her voice softer than Helen had ever heard. You're not fading. You're blooming. Without us. Helen didn't answer. She let her daughter speak. I know I've been cold, judgmental, maybe even cruel, Melissa continued. But I wasn't prepared for you to have your own life. I thought once you moved here, that was it. I thought so too, Helen said gently. Melissa looked down, fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. I came here because I wanted to ask something. Not about money or ownership, about joining you. Hella blinked. Joining me? I've been burned out, Mom. The law firm, the clients, the deadlines, it's all noise now. But what you've built here, it feels like it matters. And I'd like to help, if you'll let me. Helen studied her daughter. Not with suspicion, with curiosity. This was not the Melissa who had stormed into her office weeks ago, pointing fingers. This was someone uncertain, someone reaching. What would that look like? Helen asked. I don't know yet, Melissa admitted. I don't want to take over. I want to learn. Maybe help with outreach, organizing activities, talking to other families who are scared to let go but don't want to abandon their parents. Helen leaned back in her chair. She saw flashes Melissa at 8, collecting autumn leaves for a school project. Melissa at 22, delivering her valedictorian speech. Melissa at 48, worn thin by ambition and fear. I'll think about it, Helen said finally. Melissa nodded, seeming relieved by even that much. She stood to go, then paused at the door. Thank you, she said, for not shutting me out. As the door closed behind her, Helen exhaled slowly. Change had begun with a policy, but maybe true healing would begin with an invitation. The air that morning felt strangely heavy. Autumn had rolled in early that year, soft winds dancing through the trees outside Sunny Haven, painting the leaves golden and brittle. Helen stood by the garden window, coffee in hand, thinking about Melissa's proposal. Letting her eldest daughter into this world she'd built with such care. It felt risky. But maybe love always did. She was still lost in thought when Tracy appeared in the doorway, her face tight. It's Margaret, she said softly. Helen's mug froze midair. What happened? She collapsed in her room this morning. The ambulance is here. She's conscious but weak. Oh? Helen set her mug down and followed Tracy without a word. The hallway felt longer than usual. Too quiet. They found Margaret on a stretcher, pale but smiling faintly. You again? She said to Helen. Don't you ever take a morning off? Helen crouched beside her, gripping her hand. You scared us, Margaret shrugged. Old hearts do that, like vintage cars. They sputter sometimes. Helen tried to smile, but the tears were already stinging. Where are they taking you? County General. Just for observation, Margaret said. I'll be back in a few days. Helen squeezed her hand tighter. I'll visit, and I'll bring the cookies you like. Margaret winked. Make sure they're the chocolate kind, not that oatmeal nonsense. The EMTs wheeled her out, and the silence that followed felt colder than the early frost. Later that evening, Helen sat in Margaret's room, the bed neatly made, her scent still lingering in the air. On the nightstand was a small, leather-bound journal. Helen hesitated, then picked it up. A note slipped out. For Helen, if you're reading this, it means I didn't come back as quick as I hoped, and there are things I want you to know. Helen sat down slowly, journal in her lap. The first few pages were musings, memories of Margaret's time as a jazz singer in New Orleans, photos of her late husband, clippings of poetry. But then, halfway through, came the truth. I have stage 4 congestive heart failure. I've known for months. Didn't want to burden anyone. Least of all you. Helen's breath caught. You gave me the best last chapter I could have asked for. You reminded me I was still alive, that I could still matter. I just didn't want to ruin that with hospital gowns and beeping monitors. Tears blurred the page. I don't need more time, Helen. I just need peace. But if I go, promise me you'll keep fighting for this place, for the people who still think it's too late to matter. Oh, Helen pressed the book to her chest. The next morning, Margaret's condition worsened. By afternoon, they moved her to hospice. Helen visited every day, read her old poems aloud, played her favorite jazz records from a Bluetooth speaker balanced on the windowsill. On the 5th day, Margaret opened her eyes and whispered, "Let Melissa in." Helen blinked. "What?" "You heard me," she said, voice raspy. "Let her into Sunny Haven, into your heart, into your mess. People only knock so many times before they stop trying." Helen smiled sadly. "You're full of advice for someone dying." Margaret grinned weakly. "Dying gives you excellent perspective." That night, Margaret passed peacefully in her sleep. A nurse found Helen asleep in the chair, still holding her friend's hand. The following week, Helen stood in front of the residence during a small memorial in the garden. "She taught me that it's never too late for connection," she said softly. "Even when the time is short, the impact can be eternal." She placed Margaret's journal on the memory shelf, alongside others from residents who had passed. That evening, Helen called Melissa. "I'd like you to come in next week," she said. "We'll start with 1 day a week. You'll listen more than you speak, but we'll try this together." Melissa paused on the other end. "Thank you, Mom," she said, voice thick. "I won't let you down." Helen looked out the window. The garden still swayed gently in the wind, a single leaf dancing toward the ground. She smiled. "None of us know how much time we have," she whispered, "but we can choose how we use what's left." Melissa arrived at Sunny Haven on a Monday. It was early, too early for most residents to be up, yet the halls already hummed with soft movement. Nurses pushing breakfast carts, Tracy jotting notes at the reception desk, and Helen waiting with 2 cups of coffee in hand. "I wasn't sure if you took cream," Helen said as she handed one over. Melissa smiled. "Still don't, but I'll drink it." They didn't speak much as they walked through the halls. Helen pointed out small updates. A new bookshelf near the sunroom, bird feeders outside the east wing, and a freshly painted mural in the children's visiting corner. Melissa nodded, absorbing. When they reached the volunteer room, Helen handed her a clipboard. "You'll shadow Mrs. Torres today. She's leading storytelling for the memory care wing. Be present. Be gentle." Melissa glanced at the assignment. "Got it." Helen placed a hand on her arm. "You're not here to fix anyone. Just listen." And Melissa met her mother's eyes and nodded. The morning passed in a blur of gentle voices and soft-spoken memories. Melissa sat beside Mr. Lindstrom, who had Alzheimer's but could still recite 1,932nd jazz lyrics by heart. She helped Miss Evelyn spell out her childhood dog's name with alphabet magnets. She learned more about life in 2 hours than she had in a year of depositions. But what struck her most wasn't the details. It was how freely people shared them. Their faces lit up when someone listened. After lunch, she returned to the common area, jotting notes on what worked, what didn't, her lawyer brain still active beneath the surface. That's when Tracy approached her. "Melissa, would you mind sitting with someone for a bit? One of our residents, Mr. Carver, is declining. His daughter can't get here until tomorrow." Melissa blinked. "Declining?" Tracy nodded gently. "He's not in pain, just nearing the end. But no one should go alone." Melissa hesitated. She wasn't trained for this. She didn't know the right words, but something made her say, "Of course." They led her to a private room at the end of the hall. Inside, the lights were dim, a soft jazz tune playing on a small speaker. Mr. Carver lay in bed, frail but peaceful, his breath shallow. A single photo sat on the nightstand, Him, much younger, holding a toddler in his lap beneath a Christmas tree. Melissa pulled the chair close and sat down. For a while, she just watched him breathe. Then, almost without thinking, she spoke. "My name is Melissa," she said quietly. "I don't know you, and you don't know me. But I'm going to sit here anyway." Her voice shook slightly. "I spent most of my life in rooms where people argued, where they talked over each other, proved their points, and left with less than they brought in." She looked at the photo. "But today, I just want to hold silence with you." Mr. Carver didn't steer, but the weight of the moment filled the room like music. Melissa sat for over an hour. She told him about her childhood dog, Molly, about the time she broke her arm trying to roller skate in the driveway, about her mom's meatloaf dry but made with love. And then, as the sun slanted across the floor, Mr. Carver took one final, quiet breath and didn't take another. Melissa froze. Then, without panic, she reached for his hand and held it. Tears slid down her cheeks, silent and steady. Tracy arrived a few minutes later. "He went peacefully," Melissa whispered. Tracy nodded. "He was waiting for someone. Thank you for being that someone." That night, Melissa sat across from Helen at the small staff kitchen table, hands curled around a cup of tea. "I didn't know what it meant to just be with someone. Not rescue, not argue, just be." Helen looked at her daughter and saw not the lawyer, not the wall, but a woman who had cracked open. "He changed me," Melissa said softly. "A man I never met before this morning." Helen smiled. "That's the thing about the end, sweetheart. It has a way of showing us what we forgot at the beginning." Melissa looked down, then back up. "I want to do more. Not just here. Everywhere." Helen nodded. And for the first time in decades, their conversation didn't feel like mother and daughter on opposite ends. It felt like two women building something new. A week later, Helen found Melissa sitting in the staff lounge, surrounded by notepads, sticky tabs, and a printed map of South Carolina dotted with pins. "What are you plotting?" Helen asked, raising an eyebrow. Melissa looked up, eyes alight. "Expansion." Helen stepped closer. "Not franchising," Melissa clarified quickly. "Something more like a public initiative, a pilot program for elder care reform. We take what's working here, dignity-based decision-making, community storytelling, holistic wellness, and offer support to other facilities. Grants, workshops, maybe even mentorship from our staff." Helen blinked. "You want to take Sunny Haven statewide?" "Eventually," Melissa said. "But for now, Charleston County. One small step." Helen folded her arms. "What changed?" Melissa smiled. "A man named Mr. Carver." Helen sat down across from her daughter. "It won't be easy. I know. You'll face people who don't want change. I'm used to that." Helen studied her daughter, the determination in her brow, the softness in her eyes. She saw for the first time, not just a brilliant mind, but a humble one. A mind willing to bend, not just win. "I think we should try," Helen said softly. Melissa beamed. They spent the next few days gathering notes, outlining structures, drafting proposals. Melissa worked late into the night. Helen proofread by day. Even Tracy chipped in, compiling testimonials and staff feedback. One evening, as Helen was returning to her apartment, she found a cream-colored envelope slipped under her door. No return address. She opened it slowly. "Dear Helen, if you're reading this, it means I've done the one decent thing left in me. I wrote instead of showing up. I heard about Sunny Haven. From a friend of a friend. I couldn't believe it at first. You, running a care home? But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. You always had the heart. I just didn't know how to hold it. I won't take much of your time. I just wanted to say what I never did properly. I'm sorry. For leaving. For making you carry everything. For not being the kind of father the kids needed. I'm living in Asheville now. Quiet life. No demands. I think I needed that to realize what I gave up. If you ever want to write back, you don't have to. But know this. I see you now, Helen. And I hope they do, too. James." Helen read the letter 3 times. She didn't cry. She didn't feel rage. Just Stillness. She tucked the letter into a drawer beside Margaret's journal. The past was not undone by apology, but perhaps a piece of it had finally been honored. The next day, during a strategy meeting, Melissa paused mid-sentence. She looked up from her laptop. "Can I ask you something?" Helen glanced up. "Of course." "And do you remember the day Dad left?" Helen stiffened slightly, then nodded. Every detail. "I was 16, Melissa said. Old enough to know what was happening. Old enough to pick sides." Helen leaned back, waiting. Melissa continued, "I blamed you. For years. Because you were the one who stayed. The one who didn't chase him. Who got up the next morning and packed lunches like nothing happened." Helen was silent. "I didn't understand then," Melissa said. "That surviving is a kind of strength. That pretending sometimes is how people keep going." Helen nodded slowly. "I wasn't pretending. I was preserving." Melissa smiled sadly. "I see that now. And I'm sorry. For all the years I spent punishing you for holding everything together." Helen reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Grief is heavy," she whispered. "And sometimes the ones who carry it get mistaken for cold." Melissa squeezed her hand. "Not anymore." Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Helen returned to her apartment. She poured herself a cup of tea, opened her window, and listened to the sounds of the garden residents laughing, wind chimes singing, life continuing. In her heart, something old had shifted. Not erased, but softened. The way winter melts, not suddenly, but surely. The conference center buzzed with tension. Rows of suited professionals milled about, name tags gleaming and coffee cups in hand. Slideshows blinked across projector screens, filled with bar graphs, efficiency metrics, and buzzwords like scalability and cost optimization. Helen adjusted the scarf around her neck, feeling oddly out of place in her soft gray sweater and practical shoes. Melissa stood beside her, radiating polished confidence in a navy blazer, clutching the folder that contained their proposal. "You sure you want to be here?" Melissa asked gently. Helen gave a small smile. "No, but I'm sure I need to be." Their session was scheduled for 2:30. At 2:15, they found their seats near the front of the conference room. The moderator, a brisk woman from the State Health Board, stepped up to the podium. "Our next session is a pilot presentation from a community-based elder care facility that's been generating interest across Charleston County." She paused, then smiled. "We'll hear first from attorney Melissa Whitaker, and then at her request from the facility's lead operator, Helen Whitaker." Helen's head snapped up. "Wait, what?" Melissa turned to her mother, eyes twinkling. "Surprise." Helen glared. "You planned this?" "You'll thank me later." Melissa began her presentation, confident and clear, using simple slides with photos of residents laughing, planting flowers, dancing in wheelchairs. There were no graphs, no acronyms, just stories. And that's what held the room. When she finished, she stepped aside and gestured to her mother. Helen walked slowly to the podium. For a moment, she just looked at the audience, nurses, directors, analysts, a sea of skeptical eyes. "My name is Helen Whitaker," she said finally, "and I'm 73 years old." A small murmur rippled through the room. "I'm not a doctor. I'm not a therapist. I'm not trained in institutional management. But I know what it feels like to be discarded. To be told directly or indirectly that your usefulness has expired." She let the silence settle. "Sunny Haven isn't perfect, but it was built on a simple truth. Aging doesn't strip you of your humanity. If anything, it deepens it. And the care we give to our elders isn't about convenience. It's about conscience." People were still, listening. "I've seen more healing in a shared garden than in a prescription. I've watched people reconnect with themselves through storytelling, cooking, laughter, things no chart can measure." She looked directly at the moderator. "This isn't innovation. It's restoration." A slow wave of applause rose from the back of the room, moving forward until the entire hall was on its feet. Helen's hands trembled as she returned to her seat. Melissa whispered, "You were amazing." "I'm going to kill you later," Helen whispered back. As they stepped out of the conference hall, a man approached them tall, with silver hair and a crisp suit. "Helen Whitaker?" he asked. She turned. He extended a hand. David Holt. We met 10 years ago at the Columbia Regional Board meeting. You probably don't remember. Oh, I remember, Helen said, her voice flat. You told me I was wasting time trying to humanize a broken system. David blinked. Well, it seems I was wrong. Helen raised an eyebrow. I'm now on the advisory committee for the South Carolina Aging Coalition, he said. And I'd like to invite you to speak at our January summit, and to join our review board for care model grants. Helen said nothing for a moment. Then, you know I'm not one for rubber stamps. We don't need rubber stamps, he said. We need people who make noise. Melissa nudged her gently. You should do it. Helen looked from her daughter to David, and then out at the people bustling through the corridor, papers in hand, rushing between rooms. All right, she said. Let's make some noise. That night, back at Sunny Haven, Helen sat on the bench outside the greenhouse, the night air cool on her skin. Melissa joined her with 2 mugs of chamomile tea. You forgave him, Melissa said. I didn't, Helen replied. I just outgrew the anger. Melissa nodded. They sat in silence for a while. You know, Helen said, there was a time I thought I'd be invisible forever. Melissa reached for her mother's hand. Not anymore. Helen looked up at the stars. Number? Not anymore. It started with a whisper in the hallway. 2 residents, Mr. Langley and Miss Ruby, had been found in a compromising situation in the greenhouse after hours. A staff member, startled, had reported it as inappropriate behavior. By morning, the rumor had bloomed across the facility like wildfire. Helen read the incident report twice before setting it down. Melissa stood across the room, arms crossed. We need to act, fast. Helen raised an eyebrow. And what exactly does that mean? Statement. Investigation. Immediate policy reinforcement. If this gets out. If this gets out? Helen repeated, voice calm. You mean if 2 consenting adults over 70 express affection, and the outside world finds out they're still human? Melissa faltered. That's not what I said. You didn't have to. There was silence between them. Tracy knocked gently before stepping in. Miss Ruby's daughter just called. She's threatening legal action. End of Helen sicht. Of course she is. Melissa paced. This isn't about morality. It's about liability. If we don't act, we could lose funding, or worse, be shut down. Helen's tone was firm. And what would acting look like? Separating them? Restricting contact? Posting guards at the door? Melissa's voice rose slightly. You're being idealistic. This isn't just a garden romance, Mom. It's a governance issue. And I say it's a dignity issue. Their eyes locked. 2 women, mother and daughter, so alike, yet standing on opposite ends of a line neither wanted to draw. Later that afternoon, Helen requested to speak privately with Miss Ruby. She found her sitting on the back porch, a shawl around her shoulders, staring at the fading light. Ruby, Helen said softly. Miss Ruby turned, her face lined but resolute. You here to scold me? Helen shook her head. I'm here to ask if you were okay. If you are okay. Ruby smiled wistfully. We were just slow dancing. The music was in our heads. But I suppose when you're old, any closeness looks suspicious. Helen sat beside her. You have every right to that closeness. Ruby sighed. You know what hurts most? Not the shame. It's the assumption that I'm not capable of choice, of love. That age erases consent. Helen squeezed her hand. It doesn't. And it won't, not here. But Melissa wasn't ready to let it go. That evening, the board requested an emergency meeting. Melissa presented the facts clearly. Professionally, then proposed a new behavioral ethics code for residents. Helen listened, and when it was her turn, she stood slowly. I built Sunny Haven on the belief that autonomy doesn't expire with age, she said. We protect residents from harm, not from their own hearts. A silence fell. Then, Robert, a retired pastor and longtime resident, raised his voice. I say let the old folks dance. Laughter broke out, and slowly, one by one, others spoke. Miss Evelyn, Mr. Lindstrom, even Tracy. Helen looked across the room at Melissa, whose face was unreadable. After the meeting, Melissa lingered behind. "I was just trying to protect you," she said quietly. Helen stepped forward. "I know, but sometimes protection feels like control, and we have to be very careful where we draw that line." Melissa nodded slowly. "You're still teaching me," Helen smiled. "And you're teaching me how much I still need to be taught." They embraced not tightly, but meaningfully. 2 weeks later, Helen announced a new initiative: resident relationship circles, voluntary sessions led by a counselor where seniors could talk openly about love, boundaries, and affection in later life. It was messy. It was honest. It was beautiful. And it made Sunny Haven stronger than ever. The train to Asheville wound through hills painted gold by early November. Helen sat by the window, her fingers wrapped around a thermos of tea, the leather handle of Margaret's journal resting on her lap. She hadn't traveled this far in years, but something about the journey felt less like a departure and more like a return. She hadn't told Melissa she was going, not because she was hiding, but because some doors must be opened alone. When the train arrived, Helen stepped onto the platform slowly, taking in the crisp air. Asheville hadn't changed much, still quaint, still artistic, still a place where time slowed just enough for truth to catch up. She'd written James back weeks ago. Just one sentence. "Yes, I'd like to see you. Let's meet where we once said goodbye." It was a little bookstore near the river, the same one where, 25 years ago, she had walked out without a word after their final argument. That day, she had carried anger in her bones like firewood. Today, she carried peace. He was already there when she arrived. James looked older, of course. His once thick hair was now salt and pepper, his posture a little more stooped, but the same tired kindness rested in his eyes. And when he saw her, he stood up awkward, hopeful. "Helen," he said. "James," she replied. They sat across from each other at a small table, 2 steaming mugs between them. For a few minutes, neither spoke. Then James broke the silence. "You look strong." Helen gave a wry smile. "That's just the cardigan." He chuckled. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Neither was I," she admitted. "But I realized there's no need to carry unfinished sentences into the grave." James nodded. "I've rehearsed a dozen speeches. None of them feel right now." "Good," Helen said. "Because I didn't come here for speeches. I came to say something simple." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a photo, a black and white image of Melissa at age 6, holding a paper crown on her birthday. Beside her, Helen and James stood, arms around each other, younger than their memories allowed. Helen slid the photo across the table. "I forgave you," she said. "Long ago. I just didn't know how to live like I had." James stared at the photo, his fingers trembling. "I blamed you too," he said quietly, "for staying strong when I broke, for not coming after me." Helen shook her head gently. "We both did what we thought survival looked like. But life isn't about winning. It's about learning how to stay kind." They sat in silence again this time. Not heavy, but soft. James finally spoke. "Do you think Melissa—" "She already has," Helen said, in her way. He smiled faintly. "I always thought she'd grow up to be like me." "She did," Helen said. "Then she outgrew us both." And the pine. Back at Sunny Haven the next morning, Melissa waited in Helen's office, her brow furrowed, flipping through a binder titled Succession Timeline. Helen walked in, travel-worn but serene. "Where have you been?" Melissa asked, half worried, half relieved. "Tying off an old thread," Helen said simply. "I'm ready now." Melissa blinked. "Ready for what?" Helen sat across from her, pulling out a small brass key from her bag and setting it on the table. "You're ready," she said. "This place needs new hands. Steady hands. And I need to start listening to mine, because they're getting tired." Melissa looked at the key, then at her mother. "But I just started learning," she said. "You never stop," Helen replied. "You just stop pretending you need to know everything before you begin." Melissa's throat tightened. "I don't want to lose you." "You're not," Helen said gently. "You're just meeting a different me." They sat for a long moment. Then Melissa reached across the desk and took the key. That evening, Helen sat alone in her apartment, watching the sun dip behind the garden wall. She pulled Margaret's journal into her lap and opened to the last page. She picked up her pen and, in slow, careful script, wrote, "Today, I gave away what I once built to protect myself. But I've learned that true legacy isn't what we hold. It's what we're brave enough to pass on." The days that followed, Helen's quiet handover passed like pages in a well-loved novel, slow, deliberate, full of small joys and quiet goodbyes. Melissa took over officially on the first Monday of December. There was no grand ceremony, no speeches, just a printed schedule with her name at the top and her mother's signature at the bottom. Yet for Helen, it felt like crossing a bridge she had built, stone by stone, now finally solid enough for someone else to walk on. She spent her mornings differently now, sipping tea in the garden, helping Miss Evelyn organize knitting circles, sharing crossword puzzles with Tracy in the break room. For the first time in years, her days were not filled with duty, but presence. One evening, Melissa knocked on the door to her apartment, holding a small box. Inside was a brass nameplate. Helen Whitaker, founder, Sunny Haven, a place where people were never forgotten. Helen held it in her hands for a long time. Then she looked up at her daughter. "You made this?" Melissa smiled. "We all did." Helen didn't cry, but her voice softened. "I thought, when I let go, I'd vanish." Melissa sat beside her. "You didn't let go, you gave." Helen nodded. "And it feels lighter." That weekend, Helen stood by the greenhouse, watching two residents, Mr. Langley and Miss Ruby, planting tulip bulbs side by side. Their laughter drifted on the cool December air like wind chimes. Behind her, the building hummed gently with life. Babies giggled in the family lounge. Crock pots bubbled with soup in the kitchen. Somewhere, an old record played Ella Fitzgerald. Helen breathed it in like a prayer. She turned to Margaret's bench, the one beneath the white azaleas, and sat down. The journal rested on her lap, its pages nearly full now. She flipped to the last one. "I once feared growing old meant growing invisible," she wrote. "But I was wrong. Growing old just means growing real, finally. Entirely. Without needing to prove anything anymore. I spent decades thinking legacy was something you leave behind. But now I know. It's something you place gently into another's hands while you're still here to see it bloom." She paused, her pen hovering above the paper. Then she added, "The afternoon knows what the morning never suspected." Robert Frost. Helen closed the journal. She sat quietly for a while, hands folded on her lap, watching the sun begin its descent over the trees. She thought of James, of the letter now resting in her drawer. She thought of Melissa leading the morning staff meeting with steady confidence. She thought of all the lives that passed through these halls, each carrying their own scars, stories, and songs. And she smiled, because she had finally learned the most sacred truth. She had not been forgotten. She had simply been becoming. Dear listener, if you've made it to the end of this story, thank you. We hope Helen's journey reminded you that it's never too late to start again, that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, and that your story, no matter how long it takes to unfold, is still being written even now. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below. Tell us what part of Helen's journey reminded you of your own. And if you haven't yet, we'd be honored if you'd like, subscribe, and join us again for more heartfelt stories like this. Because here, in this little corner of the internet, no one is forgotten.